I'm going to present also yet different ideas on consciousness than are sometimes usually heard. So I'll first talk about this position called neurorepresentationalism. What is it? What do we mean with consciousness? I'll go into insights from generative models of perception. And I'll go into why multisensory integration is such a key problem to study in the field of consciousness, and close with some experimental results on multisensory interactions in the cortex and the role of recurrency. The topic is introduced here with this man having missing a leg, amputated. Still, apparently, he's very much aware of a cold sensation, or he expresses this behaviorally, while, of course, there is no sensor in the appropriate foot anymore. And so you can ask, where is the sensation of cold water actually happening? Where is it? Can we localize it? This is a problem of consciousness. On the right-hand side, you see the rotating snakes illusion of Kitaoka, where probably not all of you, but many of you are likely to see some rotating snakes, or as it is called, the rotating snakes illusion, particularly in the periphery, so not where you foveate, but rather around it. And also here you can ask, where are the illusory features located? It's always nice to take a poll and see what you think. I also ask it to students, and often they would say, well, it can't be there really physically on the screen, right? Because if you start to measure movement, there is none. It's an illusion. So the second answer many people resort to is that it's in the brain, but that's, I think, also a little problematic, because if a surgeon would open up the skull and go search for the rotating snakes, you find blood vessels, you find neurons. There's nothing blue out there. So literally, rotating snakes in the brain is also problematic. Third answer could be, say, well, it's nowhere. Okay, yeah, it's an illusion, it's not real, but you do see something in front of you. That's also a given for the illusions. So I try to drive then people to say, well, yeah, the brain is active here. It is generating a representation. The result of that process is more or less projected. It's happening as if it is outside us, outside the brain. And that's, the representational property of consciousness that we talk about. So somehow the brain has this ability to generate representations that we experience as happening outside ourselves. Then we have to define a couple of hallmarks of conscious experience, not to define consciousness directly head-on yet. I would submit that consciousness has several modes, like perception being externally driven by stimuli, imagery much more internally driven, still under cognitive control, but also dreaming as a less cognitively controlled mode of experience, but still very much phenomenal experience. What are its hallmarks? I'm going to highlight a few. Qualitative or multimodal richness, I would propose as a key feature. You do recognize this by the Renoir painting, kind of happens to be here appropriately in Paris, where you already recognize in the visual modality several submodalities like color, texture, shape, etc. No movement, but then we also have to realize that the painting is not experienced in total isolation. It's a visual experience, but what we really talk about in consciousness is the person looking at the painting, meaning that it is always accompanied by, let's say, proprioception, have a background feeling of standing upright there. So it's more about the situation that the lady is in, vestibular sensations, proprioception, motor activity, audition, chemosenses, and so on. All of this going on at the same time. So this describes the multimodal qualitative richness. The situatedness then also comes with this. You could also call it space, but I'd rather talk about the situation because it is a space filled with objects that we interact with. And being immersed means, you're sort of in the middle of this experience. There's no phenomenal distance towards the painting, yes, but not towards the own situation in which you find yourself. Then integration, it's a very multifarious topic, but we do experience a unity, It's not the first time this is said, but I would also submit that this consists of multiple processes. Integration, for instance, for stereoscopic vision from monocular images. Integration also here between the senses, as in the ventriloquist effect, vision, audition being attributed to one source, the puppet, and so on. Multiple problems of integration being solved in conscious experience, but also dynamics and stability, which can be illustrated on the one hand, dynamics by the stream of consciousness, the conscious updating of experience that happens continuously, according to William James, for instance, but also stability, here illustrated with the Necker cube, where you can switch, of course, between two different views, but this doesn't happen at an infinite speed. There's a certain sluggishness in the system by which you can do that. You can train yourself to switch, but even then you're bound to a certain sluggishness in the system by which we appear to be able to switch. But a very important aspect of stability is also object constancy. So the fact that you sit here and you experience yourself in a stable position in the auditorium while your eyes are moving, it actually means, you know, your retinal image is constantly changing, even if you move your head, etc. Apparently you're correcting for that, so that the world does appear to be stable to you, and that's very functional. That's very important to be able to navigate through the world. An overarching concept in this is interpretation, intentionality, and inference. It basically means that somehow neuronal networks in the brain are able to code or represent something that is not about themselves. It's about something else, like vegetables. The vegetables are not inside our brain, they're being represented as being outside the brain. The same for the duck-rabbit interpretations. This drives down to actually defining consciousness as a functional thing. I'm not defending a functionalist position, that's very important, but I do think that consciousness has a biological function, at the same time psychological, etc. Dobzhansky was a Ukrainian geneticist who actually argued that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And if we regard consciousness also as a biological, neurobiological phenomenon, while at the same time being psychological, then we should interpret it also in terms of evolution. That is to ask ourselves, what function does consciousness have in survival and reproduction, basically. The thesis here is that survival and reproduction are subserved by actions, of course. We have to undertake these sensibly. But there are two main types of actions, one being of the reflex type or habitual type. This is where you don't need consciousness, or at least to a very minimal amount. It's the kind of very simple stimulus-response behavior that can be executed automatically. For instance, when withdrawing the hand from the hot electric plate on a stove in a reflex. You're mostly conscious afterwards as to what happened. But this contrasts with more complex decision-making, planned, goal-directed behaviors, with which we mean that basically, a lot of behaviors are goal-directed, but goal-directed behavior is a term that basically means you have to have a representation of the goal in mind before you start undertaking the action and plan it out in time. So the tree here represents, the stem is the present, then there is a great number of action options that we go through towards the end goal, often across multiple steps, like simply getting a cup of coffee over there. And so this is requiring much more knowledge or representation than a simple stimulus, because basically what is going to be important in a number of steps from here is unknown. So you have to take into account a lot of options and basically highlight the most salient, relevant things by attention. So there's an important distinction. We have to ask, how are these goals coming to be selected? This is also a very broad topic. There's motivation, homeostatic needs like for food and drinks, etc. But for this multi-step tasking, this temporal depth is a concept that also Carl Friston mentions. You need to have a survey of your situation, like what do I have in the world happening right now that could co-determine the actions. And that is to say, how to avoid potential risks that you see and how to benefit from particular pathway options into the future to reach your goal. So you have to have knowledge of your body state and the rest of the situation you're in to determine this. Like these soccer players over here, it happens to be Holland against Germany, what a coincidence. But yeah, these soccer players illustrate what kind of knowledge you need to kick the goal into the opponent's goal. You have to know where your body is, how to rotate it, where your opponent is. You're on a grass field, it's green, it means particular rules that you have to abide to play the game well. Etc. So the actual definition I would come up for consciousness is this multimodal immersive survey of your situation, including the body. How to translate this into models, computational models. This is only possible to a very limited extent, but I think a productive approach is by predictive coding principles. That is, we can computationally model without claiming that such a model is conscious directly. The paradigm goes back to Kant. Immanuel Kant already said, well, we do not have direct access to the ding an sich, but we can infer from our sensory inputs basically what should be out there. We can more or less sense that. And Helmholtz took this further into the idea of mainly unconscious inference. But he also said, well, all the brain gets is basically a series of action potential trains. We don't have access to the real world horse, but we do get information through the retinal image about the horse. And we regard it as an input layer into a predictive coding model, a generative model, that then generates in the higher areas of the hierarchy a latent representation that produces kind of predictions of what's going to be out there, where the brain is not so much interested in figuring out the retinal image, but rather what's behind it, the hidden causes, so to say. So in this process of predictions generated, feedback downward to the lower areas again, like LGN and V1, there's an interplay with the actual sensory input, and the comparison leads to the computation of errors. You could also convert this into a match scheme, but errors is basically mismatch between actual sensory input and feedback predictions. That basically summarizes one way of going about predictive coding. There's more ways. I think Walter will also tell you about it. But it's about the brain making these inferences, not so much predictions about the future, but predictions about the present, like what is going on now. And in this interplay, there's both inference and learning happening based on the errors. We know this from the modeling. The inference is about figuring out the best reconstruction now without further learning to represent what's out there. It's latent, you don't really recognize the horse, but the model is generative in the sense that you can reconstruct the input image, so the information is there. We also work with a feed-forward feedback architecture, much in the tradition of Rao and Ballard, but there are other predictive coding schemes. There are other signals possible, like attentional signals that also go in a feedback direction. There's nothing against that. And we work with unsupervised Hebbian learning and see how far we can get with those basically neurobiology-based principles. So no backpropagation, unlike some other successful predictive coding schemes. And this is a philosophical slide again. I hope you don't mind. It is basically addressing the basic philosophical stance. One can think about dualism. You can think about eliminative materialism here, but that's trying to basically get rid of phenomenal experience as being, you can sort of basically pin that down to neuronal activity. The position I adopt here is rather a dual aspect, monism, and Spinoza, Portuguese Jewish philosopher who lived in Amsterdam, proposed this also. He basically said, well, the mind and brain form one entity, one unity. They're part of the same unitary phenomenon. But we just view brain or body matter basically as distinct from the mind, from consciousness. When you take this literally, then mind and brain are going to be inextricably intertwined, mind and matter, I should say. So that also implies panpsychism. That means, you know, even inanimate objects consisting of matter have some soul-like properties. I wouldn't go that far. I would rather say, well, this unity is achieved under very particular circumstances, namely in the awake brain. And not, we don't take this into inanimate nature, into the direction of panpsychism. But yeah, here you see Spinoza shortly portrayed after his death. And here you see the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam where he was excommunicated. That is, there was a cherem by which he had to leave the community altogether, was not allowed to see his family, and this is the bridge across which he walked after that. It's not there, by the way, it's just like totally abolished, but you can still go to the place. Of course, this is a general philosophical stance that needs to be elaborated when we practice neuroscience. The way I would propose this might happen is through emergence, a particular kind of emergentism, where we say, well, already if we look at a simple network like a Hopfield network, you do recognize emergent collective properties of the neurons. That is, they're able to represent patterns like this digit 4. It can be stored, it can be recalled. And that is not explainable purely from looking at the synaptic properties alone or the single cell properties. Here we have basically an animation from a predictive coding network made by Shirandora. It's about the reproduction of MNIST digits in the simulation happening across these various layers in an architecture. There you also see emergent properties. Clearly this could not be done at the level of single cells, etc. I take David Marr's scheme basically and modify it to explain that the brain has this hardware implementation level, you could say, the wetware of the brain with the synapses, the membranes, the extrapotentials, etc. But that's the bare physics of it. Marr already said, well, there's a higher level that we can recognize, the computational level that is totally functionally different, but still happens at the same time as when the wetware is operating. Different from Marr, I would submit also that there's a higher phenomenal level above that, supervenient on the computational level, which renders, kind of by a super inference process, conscious properties. That is not the whole story. We have to figure this out more anatomically and physiologically, how that could happen. I think right now we're at the stage where we do understand a little bit the assembly level, that is the level of small neural networks that do things like predictive coding. And they, basically, if we talk about a representation or a prediction, it's also a hypothesis, right, about what's going on. So these neural networks are forming and generating hypotheses about, for instance, what shape is out there, visual motion, color, etc. We do have an idea of how that happens in the brain, although it's not to any extent exact knowledge. But then I suppose that the lower level network properties can be integrated into a sort of network configurations, a meta network that builds larger hypotheses on a whole visual object, integrating the single feature objects. And we suppose this happens in systems like the visual cortical system with areas like MT for motion and the color pathways, etc. But then we still need a higher level of integration, which is dubbed here the multimodal meta-network level, where the individual modalities are also integrated into a multimodal representation that also gains spatial properties. So eventually we experience the piece of cheese on the table in its situational setting with the other objects mainly visual, but it at the same time has smell, it has solidity, tactile properties, etc. We have not so much idea about how that happens. You do see a picture here from the Allen Institute with different colors for the modalities, and you see how they anatomically intertwine. But this is a property for further study. So the idea to wrap up, let's say, the story on multisensory integration is that we do have all these different hierarchies for individual modalities, like vision, but also for audition. They're not all the same. Olfaction is very different in a way, but they are supposed to interact. And this is to basically have the dialectics of that you only can know what vision is if you also know what not vision is. You have to oppose it to different modalities to be able to integrate and also define how they relate in a multimodal topology to each other. Those higher integrative areas, there's also interaction with the executive and motor systems. But this is, by the way, a very different scheme from the global neuronal workspace idea. Non-reductionistic materialism is mentioned here because this is a stance that recognizes both the reality of phenomenal experience and neuronal, let's say, basic physical matter. They both exist, you just have to define very well how their relationship is, thereby en passant dealing with the hard problem. As you might know from philosophy, the hard problem basically asks the question of how subjectivity arises in the first place from neuronal physical properties. We think that I think the scheme goes some way in solving it, in the sense that you do have this bridging through sequential hypothesis building to higher and higher levels of complexity. On the one hand, you could always say, well, yeah, but show me where the color orange is emerging in this from the neurons. This is difficult. Our phenomenal experience, I would say, is playing only at this highest level of representation. We have no peephole, let's say, to look down from that level of experience downwards to inspect what our neurons are doing at the same time. So we, in a way, have to rely on imagination to do this, but our imagination is not built on that to do that, because imagery is by definition built on previous experience, which is phenomenal. It also offers no access. So it basically means that we cannot imagine this transition. It's a limitation of our cognitive abilities and perceptual abilities. Compare it a little bit to the Big Bang theory, where people have inferred that it happens. It's very, well, we can imagine an explosion, of course, but it's very hard to imagine that space and time also came into existence with the Big Bang. It's sort of impossible to imagine, at least for me. But you can make inferences from the background radiation picture about what happened, how it happened. And so it's all about inference. And in the same way, I would submit we can infer that, a consciousness arises in ways like I described. I now want to switch from the very abstract theoretical level to a bit more concrete computational modeling and explain the approach. Matthias Brucklacher in the lab has been developing predictive coding a bit beyond its original purpose. Because now, whereas, for instance, Rao and Ballard, they attempted to reconstruct the input image, basically. But like I said, predictive coding is also about getting at the hidden causes behind that. So one way of doing that is to say a single object can be perceived as a specific image, namely the image you have in front of your eyes. But it's also about identifying the object as being the same while the apple is rolling on, right? This is very basic, very peculiar. The apple is rolling on, we recognize it as being the same apple. Yet the image is differing, and our actions are also based on recognizing the object identity. So it means it would be very nice if we have a neural network with, let's say, low-level areas that might engage specifically in specific object representation, like of this MNIST digit 5, but also at a higher level, perhaps, the level that we compare to infratemporal cortex, have object identity represented as a constant property. It also links to some of Matthew Larkham's talk yesterday. We see the simulation here, where now the MNIST digit starts moving. This is translational variance. Area 2 has representations that differ a lot. They vary because the retinal position of the image is varying, of the digit. Area 3 also varying, but in area 4 you see something interesting there. It's the same neurons that keep on being activated, even though their activity levels differ a bit. So that's a stable activity pattern, despite the translational variance. And that also works for, basically for rotations, size invariance, affine transformations. So when you then compare the representations in the higher area, sort of comparable to infratemporal cortex, then you see that, for instance, the MNIST digit 2 generates a particular image, in the sequence it stays relatively constant. This is visualized in the representational dissimilarity matrix as blue boxes. They have a low dissimilarity, so it's constant, whereas the yellow boxes represent differences between different digits as they move about. So let's say when you have the same digit, the same sample moving, that yields a very similar representation, but if it becomes a different digit, then it yields a high dissimilarity, which is an excellent basis for categorization. But note, this all happens in an unsupervised manner. It's basically based on Hebbian learning. So that's kind of nice and interesting. It also goes in this way beyond the classical predictive coding, and we hope we can still move on with other complex properties. So the interesting situation is that kind of, this is the concept to have a network with both specific object coding in it, in the specific appearance, but also the concept. There are in fact concept cells as described for the hippocampus, where cells just keep on firing to the concept of Halle Berry, for instance, no matter how she looks like, or whether you hear her name spoken, a visual image, etc. Well, we don't go that far, but the model has this trade-off, let's say, between specific image representation and object identity, with the low areas like area 1. This is the representation of an airplane, a toy object, with some high-pass filtering on that. Area 1 is very good for reproducing the image. So if you tickle the representation there, it will reproduce your input image, this one. But the higher areas cannot do that because they are specialized in invariant representations. So when you now try to reconstruct this specific image, that's sort of inappropriate, because there was a whole series of images, in this case, rotating, and that gave rise to the invariant representation. In any case, I think it's interesting to note that both these specific image representations and object identities can be coded. Then for some experiments, right? Theory is nice, but eventually we have to get down and test things in animals in this case, or humans. The session is about neural correlates. I also want to emphasize we have to get at causal substrates. So not only look at statistical relations between whatever is reported as conscious and the neurons, but also really intervene, like with optogenetics in mice. From this concept of multi-level representations, there are several predictions that can be tested, like does multisensory interaction actually occur already in V1, the primary visual cortex, and what is recurrent activity about? You will see it more during the sessions. This is a picture from Super in the monkey, where famously the response is showing two phases to a visual stimulus. When there is a hit detection, you find this second bump, this late activity. When there's a miss or no conscious report, then you see the green curve, much less of a second bump late response. But, is this really conscious, or is it more linked to behavioral responding? And this plays through the field. It plays with global neuronal workspace, executive functions. Whenever there's an over decision, a motor action, it's going to affect the system. Here, Matthijs Ouderlohuis and Jean-P, two PhD students in the lab with Umberto and me, set out to investigate this in a multisensory detection task. It's mice being trained on a task where they have to detect either an auditory change or a visual change. So in a way they have to identify the modality in which the change happens. But they're all also unisensory trained mice, so they only have to detect the visual change. And then there's a naive group, but that's less important here. What you do see in this task setting is strong auditory responses in the visual cortex in V1. Like this neuron has a big increase in firing rate. Purple bars are the spikes, and the black note is when the animal starts licking, because that's the overt behavioral response. For instance, lick to the left if there's an auditory change, lick to the right if there's a visual change in the multisensory trained mice. These are the V1 recordings with silicon probes, and you do see in this multisensory task that this is the firing to the auditory stimulus in V1 and the firing to the visual stimulus on the x-axis. Well, you do see, as expected, visually responsive neurons. that have very little to do with the auditory input. Those are the blue dots, but there are also cells that respond primarily to the auditory stimulus, or to both. This is the magenta cloud of dots. So there's quite a powerful representation of, or at least response to the auditory stimulus, which is of course a bit surprising if you think of the modalities as being always segregated. But certainly at the level of V1, that's supposed to be really primary visual cortex. But there's a potential confound, and that was also pointed out by a study of Stringer et al. From the lab of Carandini and Harris at UCL. And they said, well, let's also look at the motor activity of the mouse. And particularly, stimuli when salient, when arousing, can elicit orofacial motor activity. You see that also here in the video. This is the mouse licking, but at the same time there's a lot going on in the whiskers and the other facial muscles that are moving there. So you can quantify this as video motion energy, basically, and it's quite powerful with like a very salient auditory stimulus, the Amax. You see how the video motion energy strongly increases, but also in the other conditions of less salient stimuli, this happens. And it happens quite early on. Now, this is stimulus onset at time 0. Within the 100 milliseconds, you have this motion coming up. So that could be a quite heavy confound, or at least an interesting phenomenon. But yeah, one has to admit that this motor activity dominates the late response phase. You can see that over here, for instance, this is a GLM analysis where you correlate basically the influence of audition on the firing rate of V1 cells. Over time, this is again the sensory change onset. The red curve is the statistics of the auditory activity, so that's still present in V1, that's important to note. And it's quite early after onset of the stimulus. The green curve represents the motor activity, and you can see this back very clearly in V1 cells that correlate perfectly to orofacial activity. But not all cells do that, luckily. It just points out how tricky it is to interpret this recurrency in terms of consciousness. I mean, here, it's mainly about motor activity. That's the persistence also of the green curve happening. Here you see the comparison of the, let's say, visual and auditory responses in V1 again, where you do see that the auditory response actually kicks in earlier than the visual response. That's also very interesting. The blue is the visual response curve, the auditory is the red curve, and there's a latency of about 20-25 milliseconds between the two. So that's probably due to the very fast auditory propagation into auditory cortex, A1, which then should reach V1. We know by Massimol experiments by now that if you block A1 activity, so primary auditory areas, then this signal is much less indeed. So there seems to be a cortico-to-cortical interaction. Then finally, the optogenetics to assess causal importance. This is the optogenetics experiment done by Matthijs Oude-Lohuis and Jean Pie. Basically, we silence V1 activity by activating the inhibitory neurons, the parvalbumin cells, with blue laser-like pulses on V1. And this is working. This is a multi-unit activity trace that shows that. Now we do the experiment in two phases where first there's like a total blockage of V1 or near total blockage of V1 activity from the stimulus onset, and this is done both in the unisensory condition and the multisensory condition. And then later on we, almost there, yeah, thank you. And later on we only block the late phase. As you see by these dashed lines, indeed the firing activity is heavily going down upon the optogenetic inactivation. If you do this early silencing of V1, then visual detection is always impaired. It's kind of a control experiment, because this is what you would expect, while the audition stays intact. So if there's an auditory stimulus, it's still being detected, but visual responses are pretty much abolished. This is somewhat reassuring because, after all, then the visual cortex is still a visual cortex. It's not causally important for audition. The silencing doesn't cause deafness. But if you look at the Now, the other condition with the late inactivation, right? We're interested here in blocking selectively the so-called recurrent feedback activity, the late phase. Then what happened? You now have a first wave of V1 activity passing through to higher areas, to the motor decision areas. But is that always enough? Well, interestingly, you see that the simple visual detection is not impaired. This is the unisensory condition where the mouse doesn't have to arbitrate whether there was a visual or auditory change. So that's not impaired. Apparently, the fast feed-forward wave there, the first bump, is enough to, let's say, inform the motor systems about decisions, about what has to be done. But the late silencing does impair the multisensory condition, in which now the arbitration between choosing for a visual or auditory change has to be made. And so that is impaired. It basically says that V1 in its late phase with recurrency remains causally important. So it's not simply a relay station that passes on the visual information to higher areas. It stays in the causal loop as long as a perceptual decision has to be made. We think that's also kind of interesting to illustrate when the task is becoming more complex, V1 is also needed for longer, even when a totally different modality comes into play. To end here, a couple of take-home messages, some of which might be provocative, but we have an open discussion. I defined consciousness as this multimodal rich survey, right, of the situation, including the body, with a clear biological function. This is it's not the same as decision making, but it's to enable decision making in a complex way. The importance of multisensory integration in this process of building up higher and higher emergent representations. Philosophically non-reductionistic materialism, that's very different from eliminative materialism. And then the experimental results, which point attention to, let's say, a motor activity as a confound. Just do not go out there and say, recurrent activity is consciousness, because it's not. It's more complicated. We do think that the motor activity that you do see in V1 might have a role in Ephraim's copy, just to empower this stability of your worldview, correcting for the motor information and the motor movements. And then the evidence for the audiovisual interactions in this multisensory task. Thanks for your attention, and